Hello, and welcome to my presentation. Today, I will be reviewing the official principles and procedures for providing interpretation and translation services to parents and guardians who have limited English proficiency in the Holyoke Public School District. My name is Nicholas Magnolia, and I am the lead district translator and interpreter. I supervise the translators and interpreters in the Pupil Services Department, also known as Tier 1 translators and interpreters. We are the only HPS employees who do translating and interpreting full-time as our primary role. The title of the document I am reviewing today is The Principles and Procedures for Providing Interpretation and Translation Services to Parents and Guardians Who Have Limited English Proficiency, LEP for short. Since this is a very long title, I'll be referring to it as the PNP for short. Please be sure to have a copy of the PNP handy throughout the presentation and read along. I won't read straight out of the document, but rather summarize the procedures. The main point to this introduction is to point out that Holyoke is a bilingual district, and our communications should reflect that. After all, here in Holyoke, we really only have 2 languages to think about. There's no reason we can't do this right. That said, let's take a look at the district's 5 principles. Number 1, track which parents have limited English proficiency and therefore need T&I services. Number 2, translate all essential documents. 3, interpret important general education conversations between staff and family. 4, consistent with translation of essential docs, T&I is provided to LEP parents who have children with disabilities. 5, low incidence language services will be provided in all educational settings. Low incidence languages here meaning languages other than Spanish. As I mentioned, the PNP is our district's policy on translation and interpretation, and it outlines the 5 primary principles we follow here at HPS that have to do with language access, language equity, and family engagement. In your copy of the PNP, you can see the procedures listed below the principles, describing how to comply with this policy, step by step. So let's begin. First, I want to start off by pointing out the district's values, because translation and interpretation goes hand in hand with the district's values, just like culture and language go hand in hand. At Holyoke Public Schools, we value language as a means to meaningful participation in education. T&I is aligned with our values for exploration, engagement, empowerment, and truly embracing our students and families as our own. We are proud to offer high-quality language services to LEP students and families that are linguistically competent and culturally sensitive. Additionally, T&I lines up with HPS's strategic priorities. Another important thing to point out. In the beginning, it started as more of a family engagement area. Last year when I presented on this same slide, that was the only part that was really highlighted. Now you can see there are 3 major focal points, not just family and community engagement, but also management and operations and a professional culture. engaging with our families, using language services that are linguistically competent and culturally sensitive, we're engaging our families and empowering them. By having a strong system in place and a strong sense of management and operations, right? What are the procedures? What are the protocols? Who's doing what? And how are we dividing this work? Translation is very involved in the activities of almost every department. And for professional culture, that's easy. Professional development. These kinds of presentations, making sure that everybody in the district is aware and conscious of what we're doing for language access. This is a team effort. Additionally, never mind, moving on. So the first principle of the P&P refers to determining LEP parents' language needs. Quote, HPS will use a home language survey to identify the language needs of parents and guardians of HPS students and will update information annually, end quote. There are currently 7 procedures in place to assure that this happens. Please read them all now while I summarize for you. During the annual enrollment period, the school district collects what is called the Family Language Preference Survey, found in the enrollment packet, and all responses are recorded in School Brains. This survey is different from the English Learners Home Language Survey, and it is currently available in English, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, Brazilian Portuguese, and Haitian Creole in both paper and digital formats, found in the enrollment office, in the central office. Even if a parent has indicated that they do not want translation or interpretation, they still have the right to ask for it at any time. Same goes for parents who have indicated that they want TNI, but they also have the right to refuse services. Since it may take years for LEP parents to get to the point where they no longer prefer to have translated documents or an interpreter present at their meetings, HPS will hold all language preferences in place until the parent expressly changes their preference by filling out the language preference survey form, or the language preference survey, and indicating no, that they do not want translation or interpretation. The 7th and final procedure under Principle 1 refers to this presentation that you are attending today. Making sure that everybody involved, all parties involved, staff members at the school, office members, making sure that they all know what is in the principles and procedures is going to be key to making sure that we hold our end of the bargain when it comes to language access and our own policies. Just a review, translation and interpretation do refer to 2 different things. And for that reason, we use the 2 terms separately. A translator is a person who converts a written document from one language to another, and an interpreter is a person who provides a verbal transmission of speech between people who speak different languages. So the 3rd principle, coming up in the next slide, refers to providing interpretation services. Remember, interpretation refers to oral translation, a spoken transmission of information from one language to another. Interpretation is, by nature, less structured than translation. The spoken word is, after all, just a puff of air. So how do we provide equitable access and keep track of the work that we're doing? Planning and scheduling. When meetings and events are planned and scheduled, interpretation is requested and integrated with relative ease, whether at the Tier 1 or Tier 2 level. When unplanned or unscheduled, communications suffer, which puts LEP individuals at an even steeper disadvantage. So when we're thinking about language access taking place at the school, we're always talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3, because Tier 1 is in the central office. Tier 2 are staff members who have been identified by their school leaders as having strong linguistic and cultural skills, and they have completed the UMass training, the 24 hours of training in the area of translating and interpreting in primary and secondary education. Tier 3 staff members are also bilingual staff members, also indicated as having linguistic and cultural skills, but they haven't completed the training. When Tier 3s are listed on the directory, they're automatically invited to attend the UMass training so that they can move up to Tier 2 if they so choose. So the second principle refers to translating essential educational documents into Spanish. What do we consider essential? See procedure number 1 under the second principle for a comprehensive list. This list can also be found on the Language Access page of the Staff Resource Center, also known as the intranet. At this point, it becomes crucial that the distinction between translation and interpretation be absolutely clear. In summary, the procedures are as follows. Everything considered essential, plus the budget and the Holyoke updates and various other district-wide documents, will be translated to Spanish. Simple. Some school-based documents won't be translated by Tier 1 translators, like the other essential documents, but they should be available in Spanish. In that case, school staff have flexibility in how they want to produce translations. Machine translation is the term we use to refer to translations that were completed by a tool like Google Translate or DeepL. Something to consider about machine translation is that it only has a high intelligibility rate with languages that have high contact with English, Spanish. Spanish and Chinese, for example, are those languages. Other languages should not be translated with a machine and instead submitted to Tier 1 for professional translation. The second part of the process behind machine translation is review. Tier 2 staff are the ones who have been trained to translate a document as well as review a machine translation. But make sure that you always provide them with the English copy and the Spanish copy. Parents are encouraged to reach out for a translation if they do not receive an essential document in a language they understand. However, this is not to say that we should wait for an LEP parent to come to us, as that would not really be the equitable thing to do. We're using school brains. We have information recorded. We know our parents' language preferences, and we should be able to anticipate what those preferences are when planning our communications. Through the use of translation memory software, the Tier 1 office possesses the tools to create its own machine translation database or term base that aids in producing consistent, efficient translations district-wide. In order to share this memory with schools, all translations performed at the school must be submitted to the Tier 1 translation office, both versions, the source and the target. The source being the language it was originally written in, most often English, and the target being the language it was translated into. And in case, for those of you who don't have a copy right in front of you, this is the list of essential documents, also available on the language access page of the intranet site. So, for providing interpretation services, the third principle, I want to go over some basics. If the person available to interpret is a child, another student, or a family member, then the communications must be rescheduled for a time that a qualified interpreter can be present. This is another reason why planning and scheduling is so important, so that we don't end up using the wrong person, an unqualified person, for these communications. Moving forward, I'm going to be explaining a little bit more how requests for interpretation are broken down by tiers and what tier to go to first, depending by case. But it should be very clear that children, family, students, unqualified staff, those are the ones that we are not going to have interpret our conversations. So just take a look at this graphic a little bit. This is supposed to highlight how the tiered model is working in the district. So based on the dimensions of this reverse pyramid, Tier 1 is the largest block. All requests in the district, even school-based documents, could go through Tier 1. Tier 1 has, our team has a large capacity. Last year, we did nearly 1,000 translations, and that totaled at about 13,000 pages. So Tier 1 is a really great resource. We're available for anyone, teachers, for parent-teacher conferences, calls to parents, really anything in the district. And there will be a graph after this kind of just breaking down the types of requests that can be made. On the translation side of this chart, you have our little input and output machine. We have a system called Translation and Interpretation Management. It's a set of forms and spreadsheets, efficiently moving projects through our team as we all kind of get our hands on it. We assign ourselves a project manager. The project manager assigns the translator, and the translator assigns it to the proofreader. And in the end, it's the project manager that sends it out to the person who requested. And the goal is to have it done by the time it was due, by the time it was requested. For interpretation, we're available for in-person interpretation, virtual interpretation, and other kinds of interpretation, simultaneous, consecutive. Tier 2 are dual role, trained, bilingual, qualified staff. They can interpret, however, they have other jobs and other responsibilities. So part of the flow of these requests really should go through Tier 1. If Tier 1 doesn't have the availability, the capacity, the time, then we would defer to a staff member at the school, a Tier 1 staff member. So as I was saying before, we were able to put out a good chunk of projects. So obviously I rounded up before. We were able to pull off 947 formal requests, and this is all Tier 1. This is our dashboard. So just to kind of show the value of data collection in translation and interpretation, and just, where we were able to capture some really crucial pieces of information from this. Our timeliness, we'd really like to get up. We got a C plus last year, and we're aiming for a B this time around. And in the chart at the bottom left, you can see how we were able to track the number of requests as well as the maximum number of pages that were submitted. So you can see the largest projects, we have the number of pages for each largest project. So we're able to kind of track what times of year are the busiest. And no surprise, September, January, and June. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of time on this slide. I'm going to go through some cases to try to highlight the usefulness of this chart. And this is meant to help any staff member really understand who to go to for what kind of language access request, and really tie it back to the principles and procedures, reminding us of what procedure each one of these things is really pointing to. So, first example, case number 1. A principal is outside the school, classes are over, children are getting on the bus, nobody is around who might be able to interpret when an LEP parent walks up to the principal and wants to ask a few questions. So in this scenario, there's no one around to interpret. People are leaving, but say this parent speaks Spanish. At this point, if the student is around, we can follow the advice that we got from the last slide and say, okay, the principal will tell the parent, you know, we're not understanding each other. Ask the student to please let their mom know that we will schedule a time for her to come in and us meet with an interpreter. This would be the ideal solution to this scenario. Another option would be that maybe a tier 2 or a tier 3 staff member from the school happens to be around. They would be pulled so that they can have a quick conversation with this parent, and from there determine if they need to continue the conversation and formally request an interpreter, maybe for the next day, following week. And this is an informal encounter. So as you can see here, informal encounter falls under interpretation. And really, for informal encounters, you can reach out to anyone. The principal at that time, if I had been walking by, she could have gotten a tier 1 interpretation for that quick conversation with the parent. If a tier 2 was walking by, same thing. So for informal encounters, things that can't be planned, can't be structured, naturally there has to be some kind of safety net. And so this falls under principle 3, which is providing interpretation, procedures 5 and 7. Moving on to case number 2. A parent shows up for an IEP meeting and they prefer to have an interpreter, and they express that even though in School Brains it says they only needed translation, not interpretation. The parent has a right to have an interpreter even though they didn't previously request it. So what do? We reach out probably to a tier 2 at that point. There's not enough time to get a tier 1 down from the central office. So they ask a tier 2 staff member who happens to be, say in this case, the family connector. So the family connector comes down, they see that they recognize the parent, and they feel conflicted. They express to the team leader and they say, look, like I know this parent, we actually got into an argument recently. I don't think that she trusts me. And at that point, the team leader would really have to go with the tier 2 staff member's comfort level and accept there was a dilemma there. Now, say the family connector didn't actually know this family at all, or knew them but didn't have any problems. Well, I guess that would be a different case. I guess the point here is that we need to be able to respect Tier 2's boundaries and respect that dilemmas could arise. And so if a Tier 2 can't take a meeting, this is a special education meeting, so in this case, it would have to be rescheduled. And this is a formal encounter. So technically, the first person that you would go to for a formal SPED IEP encounter would be a Tier 1. So it's natural for the situation to stop and have to be rescheduled. Now, if the parent decides to continue on without an interpreter, that's their choice. The third case, there's a disciplinary hearing. And it's happening right now. It's happening in about 15 minutes. There wasn't time to get a Tier 1 interpreter. So the principal reaches out to a Tier 2 staff member who is a paraprofessional. That paraprofessional is in the classroom for the majority of the time that this hearing is supposed to be taking place. What are they supposed to do? Do they leave the classroom unattended? Do they leave the student that they were supposed to be supporting unattended to go interpret? What happens if they're held there for longer than they were supposed to be gone? This is a real dilemma that we have to be aware of with Tier 2s, and we have to be, as leaders in the schools, you have to be willing to see that they have this conflict because this dual role exists, and that they really shouldn't be there really shouldn't be a detriment to their other position, their other responsibilities as a result of this additional responsibility. Case number 4. There's a parent-teacher conference where all of the teachers speak the same language. Do you have to get an interpreter? No, you don't. If the teacher speaks Spanish and the para speaks Spanish, and everyone else there at the table speaks Spanish, they can hold the meeting in Spanish and there's no interpretation needed. If one monolingual English-speaking teacher shows up, you're going to need an interpreter for English, not Spanish. So you might want a Tier 2 to come in and help out that teacher understand what's being said in Spanish so that everybody is on the same page. It works both ways. Last case, case number 5. You are a teacher and you have to write your progress report in Spanish to send out to the family. You're going to use machine translation. You use Google Translate, but you want it to get it reviewed. And the Tier 2 at your school is busy, or they're already reviewing some other progress reports for another teacher and they don't have enough time. The Tier 3 is available for that. And this would be covered under essential text, or, well, yeah, this counts. A progress report would count as an essential text. So even though the Tier 3 wouldn't be the first person you go to, for that reason, there is no check mark next under the Tier 3 for that category. You could still go to a Tier 3 for review and for proofreading of a document that was translated with a machine. You just have to make sure that you provide them with the English and the Spanish copy. So now we can transition into the 4th principle, which refers to special education, providing interpretation and translation services to LEP parents or guardians who have students with disabilities. These procedures are consistent with principles 2 and 3, as well as with special education requirements, meaning stricter timelines, more legal related documents, more medical related documents. Any special education related translation or interpretation must be performed by a Tier 1 or a Tier 2, but never a Tier 3. Things like IEP meetings require a specialized training only Tier 2s have. This doesn't mean to say that Tier 2s should be the first person you go to for SPED T&I services. Tier 2s are not required to accept special education related assignments. If a Tier 2 is unavailable or unwilling to interpret, they must direct the staff seeking language assistance to the appropriate staff member, and that may be a Tier 1 or another Tier 2. In addition, Tier 1 includes contracted language professionals, otherwise known as vendors or contractors, to handle any requests for translation or interpretation for which the Tier 1 translator and interpreters are not available. So the Tier 1 is a wide category. You don't just have us for people services, translators, and interpreters. You also have access to 5 different vendors as well as 2 different agencies. So the capacity for Tier 1 is actually quite large. So finally, we come to the 5th principle, which refers to providing interpretation and translation for languages of lesser diffusion, otherwise known as low incidence languages. At HPS, 8 languages besides English and Spanish are represented. Portuguese at Sullivan, Chinese at the high school and McMahon, Arabic at Morgan, Haitian Creole at the high school, Lawrence, Peck, and Opportunity Academy, Kirundi at Veritas Prep and STEM Academy, and now this year, Vietnamese at the high school and Khmer, also known as Cambodian, at McMahon School. While we have some staff at HPS who speak one or more of these languages, it is best practice that staff consistently refer to SchoolBrains to watch out for any need for translation or interpretation for languages of lesser diffusion, and to reach out to the Pupil Services Translation Office with requests. If the school is having an event and you want an LEP Haitian Creole speaking parent to attend, using the telephonic interpretation service to call the parent and confirm whether or not they will be attending will help in the planning of the event. It is automatic that there would be a Spanish interpreter present, but not necessarily so for Haitian Creole. When we see that there is a barrier between the school and the parent, and we know that the barrier exists, why should we ask the parent to climb that barrier just to ask for help? We have to go that one step further to offer the kind of language equity our families deserve in order to fully and meaningfully engage in their children's education. So please take some time after this presentation to go visit the Language Access page of the Staff Resource Center and look at the translation and interpretation page of the HPS homepage, which is available in our low incidence languages or languages of lesser diffusion. Thank you very much for your attention during this presentation. If you have any questions at all, you can always reach out by email. You can also give me a call. Our contact for the Tier 1 team is translator@hps.holyoke.ma.us, and the direct line for our office is 413-512-5358. Again, thank you. Have a good night.